You look up from your farm work as the sound of hoofbeats draws nearer. Outside, on the road to Lysimachia, dust is rising in a thin cloud from the gravel path. A small group of horsemen has drawn up to the small pile of stones standing at the crossroads again. You sigh to yourself, reflecting on the fact that another group of glory-hungry travellers has been sucked in by the stories of the stones again. You can't remember the exact details of the tales yourself now. It's been a long time since you were told them by your parents, but you recall it was something to do with the Trojans, possibly. Or long ago, anyhow. Still, people keep being drawn to its age and its mystery. You think it's all fine, but you just wish people would keep away from your land, whatever mystical pile of stones sits near your farm. What with all the fighting of late, you can't afford to let trouble come too close to you. After all, the word's going round that there's an army quartered at Lysimachia, in one of yet another of the endless battles between the people at the top of the food chain. One of the group has detached himself from the rest. He's an older man, easily into his 60s now, if not more, but a once athletic and powerful build still radiates energy. His jaw is thrust firmly forward as he listens to another man tell him the stories of the stones. Not that you can hear it from this distance, of course. The other horsemen stay back, their mounts fidgeting under them. One of the men, someone with a large nose and a hawkish glare, is shifting uneasily, squirming in the saddle. He's a good deal younger than the first onlooker, most likely no older than 40. Slowly, he draws near to the pair of men stood by the stones. Perhaps irritated, you see the first one turn around slowly and deliberately, haughtily staring down his nose at the younger man. No words are exchanged, or at least you don't think so, you can't hear it properly, but you feel the sense of entitled power even from your distant vantage point. You don't know whether this man is connected to the army quartered within the nearby city walls, but he's clearly used to giving orders. Just then, a glint of metal emerges from the younger horseman's clothing. Before anyone can react, the dagger cuts through the air and embeds itself within its target. The older man gasps and falls from his horse, crashing into the dirt with a cloud of dust. As his companions look on, frozen with horror, the attacker kicks his heels into the flanks of his horse and rides away, leaving the immobile witnesses staring at the now lifeless body. Not wanting trouble from armed men, you hurriedly turn back to your work in the field, trying to blot the scene from your memory and forget it ever happened. However, what you don't realise is that you've just inadvertently witnessed the end of an era. Before your eyes, one age has ended and another has begun. The last person confirmed to have known Alexander himself has fallen. Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander, Episode 15, Last of the Successors. Last time, we left Seleucus poised to start yet another war with the only remaining successor who had once known Alexander, Lysimachus, the ruler of Anatolia, Thrace, and a bit of Macedon. Lysimachus's murder of his own son and heir Agathocles, brought about by the political scheming at court fueled by various children of Ptolemy I, had sent his popularity plummeting, and calls had gone out for Seleucus to depose the tyrannical king. It is possible that Arsinoe, Lysimachus's wife, had wanted Agathocles out of the way so that her own children could accede to power instead. However, the nebulous reasons are not as important to our story as the aftermath of the deed. Seleucus, no doubt slavering at the thought of invasion, prepared for war. 40 years after the death of Alexander, the Hellenistic world was gearing up for yet another conflict. Now, contrary to what you might think, Seleucus was not simply plunging into warfare. In fact, he had a cause he was supposedly fighting for, rather than just the principle of, I want it, so it's mine. Lysandra, the full sister of Ptolemy II, and now the widow of Agathocles, had turned up in his realm along with Agathocles' half-brother Alexander, asking him to invade. Seleucus could claim to be restoring the son and heir of Agathocles to his rightful throne. I've done a quick bit of research, but I've been unable to find anything more about the children of Agathocles and Lysandra, other than they must have had them. Wikipedia tells me there were at least 2, and at least one of them was a son. However, I can't find a name for this child anywhere. Anyway, the important thing for our narrative is that Seleucus could claim to have the rightful heir to the throne of Thrace in his possession, and this was a political chip he was fully intent on using. Of course, there were probably already ulterior motives in his mind, but we'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, this arrival of Lysandra and her family presented the perfect opportunity. As part of his wartime preparations, he may have appointed his son Antiochus as his successor in the west, to make sure that, in the event of something happening to him, there would be a smooth transition of power. I say may have, as the wording of my sources is confusing, and it may just be that this actually refers to the previous installation of Antiochus as co-king again, which we've discussed before. It doesn't specifically mention the West, but I've reasoned that if this was a second event, it must have been the West, as Antiochus was already co-king of the eastern provinces. If he did appoint him as successor in the West, I like to think that perhaps he had Alexander the Great's death in mind, and that he didn't want history repeating itself. However, that's just a thought. A quick side note about this. I'm going to have to come back to this moment and the relationship between Seleucus and Antiochus when we introduce Antiochus I in a few episodes' time. This is because I've discovered it's a more complicated story to tell than I first thought it might be. Anyway, in the winter of 282 to 281 BCE, Seleucus headed westwards and crossed into Lysimachus' possessions in Anatolia, bent on invasion. Lysimachus had received no help from Egypt, despite the familial connections he had with his wife. During the campaigning, Seleucus captured Sardis, and Alexander, Agathocles' half-brother, captured Cotymium in Phrygia. The dating of these events is however unclear, so we don't know whether this happened before or after the key battle coming up in a moment. However, Lysimachus, already an 80-year-old man at this point, led an army out in response to the invasion. He was now already, as was Seleucus, an old man. He had, along with Ptolemy and Perdiccas, once been one of the 7 bodyguards of Alexander, and he was now one of only 2 men surviving who were confirmed to have known him. Surely a lonely position, you must think. The battle that followed is known as the Battle of Corupedium. We call it this because of the historian Eusebius, writing centuries later, after the Christianization of the Roman Empire. He named it after the Corus Plains on which the battle took place in the February of 281 BCE. We don't know exactly where this was, but the general region is southwestern Anatolia. Frustratingly, the same uncertainty exists about what exactly happened. However, we do know that by the end of the day, Lysimachus was dead, having been stabbed with a spear by a pro-Seleucus refugee from the city of Heraclea. The enraged Lysandra wanted to leave his body without burial, but Alexander instead took possession of his father's body and mollified her. Lysimachus was buried near Cardia, and his tomb could be seen for many centuries afterwards. So now there's only just the one successor remaining, Seleucus himself. This battle was decisive. None of the potential heirs of Lysimachus were able to offer much resistance, and some cities simply abandoned the old regime when the news about Corupedium got out. In Ephesus, the city where Lysimachus' widow Arsinoe was staying, the whole city went into uproar at the news of the battle, and in the chaos, Seleucus' supporters managed to seize control. Arsinoe herself only escaped in disguise. It would take Seleucus some time to assimilate his whole domain, but the path towards annexing Thrace and Macedon was now open. As you might expect, Seleucus refrained from handing over the spoils of war to Lysandra's young son, instead taking it for himself. Seleucus now had free reign in Europe, and began thinking about reuniting Alexander's empire under his own banner. After all, with the prospect of soon including Thrace and Macedon in his possessions, the only part of Alexander's empire that was still free of his influence was Egypt, and on that front he had the rightful heir to Egypt in his back pocket, Ptolemy Caraunus. All it would take was another invasion like this one. In the meantime, he pressed on to Macedon, perhaps keen to see the country he'd been born and raised in once again. Perhaps he'd made his ambition too clear to Ptolemy Caraunus, who seems to have realised that Egypt was not, in fact, going to come his way after a Seleucid invasion. He came to realise that the Seleucid realm and the future reunification which would push him out the picture rested on the narrowest of supports, namely Seleucus himself. And so we come back to the dramatisation at the beginning of this episode. Seleucus's army was stationed in the town of Lysimachia in the September of 281. Not far from the city, away from the road, was a pile of stones which was called the Argos. Tradition placed it as an altar created either by the Argonauts, of Jason and the Argonauts, or by the armies of Agamemnon before they headed off to fight the Trojan War. I don't know if this is the same altar where Iphigenia would have been killed in the myth, but it seems likely that it is in fact the same one. Or at least to me it does anyway. Seleucus was interested by these stories, and he turned his horse to examine it. Only a few men followed him. While Seleucus was listening to the stories of days gone by, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt came up behind him and cut him down. He then jumped up on a horse, which I realise means I made a mistake in my earlier dramatic retelling when I had him already on the horse, and sped away to Lysimachia, leaving behind the lifeless body of Seleucus Nicator. He had ruled in the east for 24 years before his death at the age of 77. Added to this, he'd ruled continuously in Babylon for 31, and had been a political player for over 4 decades. Well, that's Seleucus. 15 episodes and 40 years after our story started, the last of the successors and the last of the generation of Alexander is dead. The 19th and 20th century historian Edwin Bevan labelled Ptolemy the Thunderbolt as, quote, "a man in whom no trace can be discovered of humanity or gratitude," end quote, when referring to this event. But perhaps that's slightly unfair. After all, it's no more than many of the other characters of our story so far would have done if they felt their power was being threatened, while definitely ruthless. There was a very real chance that, had Seleucus lived, he would have gone on to invade Egypt in an attempt to restore what had been lost by Alexander. Instead of this, Seleucus is now dead, and with him the hopes of restoring the empire. We're not quite done with him yet, however, as next episode I'm going to review everything that's happened from 323 to 281 BCE. After that, we'll have a few non-narrative episodes so that we can catch our collective breath for a bit, before picking up where we left off with the life and subsequent reign of the new king, Antiochus I. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and feel free to contact the show's email address, afteralexpod@gmail.com, for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.